Well, good morning and welcome to today's daily devotions as we continue our series in 1 Samuel. Today we're looking at 1 Samuel chapter 7. So what has happened here so far is the Israelites are under attack from the Philistines. The Ark of the Covenant hadn't quite worked for them the way that they thought it was going to. And they had tried to use it kind of like a lucky little thing, a lucky little piece that you would have in your pocket to make sure that things go right the way that you want them to the first way. It's like when you find a lucky penny. There was that saying, find a penny right side up all the day, you'll have good luck. Something like that. That's kind of what they had thought with the Ark of the Covenant. So now, because that didn't work, they're like, okay, we're going to turn to God and we're going to use God as our very last resort, and we are going to trust in Him. And now, because they're going to appeal to God's power rather than superstition or any like lucky trinket, anything like that. But what's particularly significant about this one battle is that the Philistines were not defeated by the people of God, but rather before the people of God. In other words, God's people didn't win the battle. God won the battle, and He used the people to do it, but ultimately His people, God's people, the Israelites, they just stood there. They didn't do anything. God caused the Philistines not to fall, not by Israel, but before Israel. They turned around and they ran. And God's people didn't rely upon their own strength, but rather they relied on the strength of God. And God delivered them in a amazingly, what can be only described as a supernatural way. And with this, Samuel doesn't seem to have been with the ark when it was taken into battle or during the humiliation of the Philistines in the first couple chapters of this. But in this chapter, Samuel very much becomes a part of one of the spiritual revivals of Israel. When people repented and the Lord gave them victory over the Philistines, the spiritual things that didn't happen with the ark now happened without the ark. So God was able to intervene, and the people saw His power, and they didn't need a physical thing to really understand that He was with them and fighting on their side. And so now God was correcting the Hebrew perception that the ark was needed for God to work. He can work through anything and anyone. And here He had worked through the word of the Lord, which Samuel spoke, and the prayers Samuel offered. God took away their security blanket, their superstitious security blanket, saying that they needed a physical thing to really feel God's presence and power to be with them. He took that away and proved that He was ultimately there the entire time. Samuel told the Israelites where to look by calling on the nation to return to the Lord with their hearts. He sounds a lot like Joshua here in this point. It says, put away your gods and serve the Lord. Samuel had urged the people to get rid of their idols. He urged them to turn with their hearts and ultimately turn to God. You don't need these physical things. You don't need these little representations of what could be a small God in your eyes. Turn to God, turn your hearts towards Him, and follow Him. And they responded by ultimately repenting. They got rid of the terrible things. They got rid of their idols and the things they had put in front of God. Then He brought revival to the spiritually dry land. And if we look into a little bit of the Latin root here of revival, it means to live again. It usually refers to receiving life again after it is nearly expired. When a person has been dragged to the beach after almost drowning, and the lifeguards, they usually have CPR methods they've applied to the limp body, and the person has recovered. Those watching say the surfer is now revived. The swimmer, the person that was drowning, is alive. They're okay. They've been revived. Only the Spirit of God can bring spiritual life to a person that's spiritually dead in their sins. They need revival, but it's a painful fact that many people in the church today are barely alive spiritually. They are in fact living on life support, and they're in need of a revival in their own life. In verse 12, what I like about this, Samuel actually takes a stone and he sets it upright between Mizpah and Shen. He named it Ebenezer, explaining, "The Lord has helped us to this point." It's hard to miss the power of the symbol and what Samuel does in verse 12. He ultimately shows this place, in this very spot, God helped us. It's a reminder to the people that every time they see it, they remember the mighty hand of God in saving his people. What I love about this is it's a reminder. How many times have we forgotten the power of God? How many times have we forgotten what God will bring us through? But we find those small reminders here and there. You find a note, you find a journal, you find something to prove that God has brought you through that. And then you remember, oh my word, thank you, God, for bringing me through that. Thank you, God, for walking with me beside everything that I've gone through. And this is exactly what Samuel does. He uses that stone, and it says, in other words, every time you look at the stone, remember the Lord who helped you. And then the Lord has helped us. Never forget the true and living God. He is God. He is powerful. He is mighty, and he is able to help you get through any situation, any storm, any trial, and even in the highest points of your life, God is with you, and he's walking beside you. And you can hear in those words not only gratitude to the Lord had delivered God's people in the past, but an anticipation and a certainty that he will help them again in the future. He's the same God yesterday, today, and forever. That means his power is unchanging. That means his presence is unchanging. He's going to be with them, with you, with God's people through everything that they go through. The God who had helped his people this far is the same God who's going to help the people thus forward, guiding his people to future victories. And like I said, remembering God's help in the past is always important. Thank you so much for joining us for today's daily devotional. God bless.